The air in the auction barn was thick with the smell of hay, dust, and dismissal. It hung heavy, a suffocating blanket of judgment that settled on the stooped shoulders of a creature who seemed too fragile to bear it. In the center of the ring stood a young bull, a caricature of what he was supposed to be. His bones were a road map of starvation, his hide a dull, patchy canvas of brown and white. He trembled, not with the barely contained power of his kind, but with a deep, marrow-chilling fear. Laughter, sharp and cruel, ricocheted off the wooden rafters. A man in a sweat-stained cowboy hat called out, "I've seen better hides on a taxidermist's floor." The auctioneer, a man whose voice was usually a booming crescendo of value, could barely muster a monotone. He started the bidding at $50. Silence. He dropped it to 20. More silence, punctuated by a few derisive snorts. $10, gentlemen? Can I get 10 for this specimen? The silence stretched, becoming an insult in itself. The bull's head hung low, his eyes wide with a liquid terror that understood humiliation even if it couldn't understand the words. Just as the auctioneer was about to declare him a lost cause, to send him to a fate no one dared name, a hand went up in the back. It wasn't a confident gesture. It was a slow, deliberate movement from a man who seemed to prefer the shadows, a man nobody had paid any mind to. His face was weathered, etched with lines that spoke of sun and sorrow in equal measure. He said nothing. He just held up 2 fingers. The auctioneer squinted. "Sir, I'm looking for a bid, not a peace sign." A ripple of chuckles went through the crowd. The quiet man's voice, when it came, was soft, almost lost in the cavernous space. Yet, it cut through the noise. $2. The laughter died instantly, replaced by a stunned, confused silence. $2 wasn't a bid. It was a statement, an absurdity. The auctioneer, bewildered, looked from the quiet man to the pathetic animal in the ring. He shrugged, eager to be done with the spectacle. "Sold. For $2, to the man with more pity than sense." The gavel fell with a crack that sounded like a final judgment. But for the weakest bull in Texas, and the quiet man who saw him, it was not an end. It was the beginning of an impossible story. The journey home was a silent negotiation between terror and patience. The old pickup truck rattled along dusty Texas roads, its engine a low, rhythmic grumble. In the back, enclosed within the metal bars of a stock trailer, the young bull stood on unsteady legs, swaying with every turn. His world had been a series of harsh noises, rough hands, and the constant pressing fear of the unknown. This was no different. He could feel the vibration of the road through his hooves, see the world blurring past in flashes of green and gold, but none of it made sense. He was a creature adrift in a sea of terrifying sensations. Every bump in the road was a jolt of panic, every squeal of the brakes a fresh wave of adrenaline. In the driver's seat, Arthur gripped the wheel with hands that were calloused and strong, yet his touch on the gearshift was gentle. He didn't turn on the radio. He didn't hum. He drove with a profound, focused quietude, as if the silence itself were a balm he was trying to offer his new charge. He would glance in the rearview mirror, not at the traffic behind him, but at the small side mirror, angled to give him a sliver of a view into the trailer. He could see a patch of brown hide, the twitch of an ear, the wild, frightened roll of an eye. He saw the trembling, and in that trembling, he saw a reflection of a feeling he knew all too well. Loneliness, the kind that makes you feel breakable, as if a strong wind could shatter you into 1,000 pieces. He didn't see a worthless animal. He saw a kindred spirit cloaked in a body that had been failed by the world. When they finally turned off the main road and onto a long gravel driveway, the sound of the tires changed to a soft crunch. The truck slowed, pulling to a stop beside a simple, whitewashed farmhouse and a sturdy, empty barn. The place was neat, but profoundly still. It was a landscape of solitude. Arthur turned off the engine, and the sudden silence was immense, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the rustle of wind through a stand of old oak trees. He didn't immediately jump out. He just sat there, for a long, quiet minute, letting the peace of the place settle. Then he whispered, as if to himself, but loud enough for the wind to carry. "All right, son, we're home." He moved slowly, deliberately, as he unlatched the trailer door. He didn't swing it wide open. He opened it just enough for the bull to see out, to smell the sweet scent of fresh grass and clean earth. The bull flinched back, expecting a blow or a shove. Instead, Arthur just stood there, his body angled away, non-threatening. He didn't look the bull in the eye. He looked at the barn, at the pasture beyond. His voice was low and melodic. "Easy now. Just take your time. No one's gonna rush you here." It was the first gentle word the bull had ever known, and in the quiet stillness of that Texas evening, a fragile seed of trust, impossibly small, began to find purchase in the barren soil of his fear. The first few weeks were a delicate dance on the edge of a knife. The young bull, whom Arthur had started calling Goliath in a private act of hopeful irony, spent his first days huddled in the far corner of the spacious, clean barn stall. He was a statue of fear, refusing to eat, refusing to drink, refusing to believe that the absence of pain was anything but a temporary lull before a greater storm. Arthur never forced him. He would bring a bucket of fresh, cool water and a small pail of sweet grain mixed with rich molasses, placing them just inside the stall before backing away and sitting on an overturned bucket just outside the door. He would sit there for hours, sometimes mending a piece of leather tack, sometimes just watching the dust motes dance in the shafts of afternoon light. He spoke to Goliath constantly, his voice a low, soothing murmur. He didn't talk about expectations or strength. He talked about the weather, about the way the bluebonnets were starting to peek through the grass along the fence line, about a hawk he saw circling high overhead. He narrated the quiet, simple life of the farm, weaving a tapestry of gentle words around the bull's terrified silence. "Sky's putting on a show tonight, big fella," he'd say, as the sun bled orange and purple across the horizon. "Real pretty. That old oak tree looks like it's on fire." For 3 days, Goliath didn't move. His ribs seemed to grow sharper, his weakness more profound. Doubt began to creep into the edges of Arthur's resolve. The $2 felt less like a bargain and more like the price of a fool's errand. The mocking laughter from the auction house echoed in his memory. But then, on the 4th morning, something shifted. As Arthur sat in his usual spot, speaking softly about the morning dew, he saw Goliath's head lift just a fraction. The bull's nostrils flared, tentatively taking in the scent of the grain. He took a single, hesitant step forward, then another. His movements were shaky, a marionette with tangled strings, but they were his own. He lowered his head to the pail, and the sound of his rough tongue scraping against the metal was the most beautiful music Arthur had ever heard. It was a beginning. From that day forward, progress was measured in inches. The first time Goliath drank from the water bucket while Arthur was still in the barn. The first time he didn't flinch when Arthur reached out to slowly, carefully, replace his empty grain pail. The true breakthrough came a week later. Arthur was sitting on his bucket, humming a nameless, tuneless song, when he felt a strange, warm pressure against his shoulder. He froze. Turning his head with painstaking slowness, he saw that Goliath had crossed the invisible barrier between them. The bull had rested his heavy head on Arthur's shoulder, and in his large, dark eye, there was no longer terror. There was a question. There was a flicker of a deep, burgeoning trust. Arthur's own eyes welled up. He slowly raised a hand, his fingers trembling slightly, and gently stroked the bull's cheek. The hide was still rough, but beneath it, there was life. There was warmth. "There you go," Arthur whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "There you go, Goliath. We're in this together." Arthur's quietness wasn't a choice born of simplicity. It was a fortress built around a hollow space. Years ago, the farmhouse hadn't been so still. It had echoed with the laughter of a wife whose smile was as bright as a Texas sunrise and the thud of a small boy's boots running down the hallway. The solitude that now defined his existence was not the peace he had chosen, but the silence that was left behind after a cruel highway accident had stolen his world in a single, screeching moment of twisted metal and shattered glass. He stayed on the farm because it was the only place their ghosts felt close. He mended the same fences his son had tried to climb. He sat on the same porch where his wife had shelled peas into a porcelain bowl. But the joy had been replaced by a quiet, gnawing grief that had hollowed him out, leaving him a shell of the man he once was. The neighbors saw him as a recluse, a sad, solitary figure lost in his own sorrow. They would wave from their trucks as they passed, but few ever stopped. They didn't know how to breach the walls he had built. He didn't know how to let them in. In healing Goliath, Arthur was, unknowingly at first, mending the broken pieces of his own spirit. The bull's profound need gave him a purpose beyond just getting through the day. Goliath's fear was a tangible thing he could soothe, unlike the formless, ever-present ache in his own chest. Every small victory with the bull was a tiny chip in the armor around his heart. When Goliath finally took that first bite of grain, it was a taste of hope that Arthur himself hadn't experienced in years. When the bull rested his head on his shoulder, it was a weight of connection, a physical anchor in a life that had felt adrift. The man who had forgotten how to care for himself was now pouring all his latent tenderness into this broken creature. He would spend hours grooming Goliath, his hands working a curry comb through the matted, dull fur, slowly revealing a healthy sheen beneath. He would talk to the bull about his wife, about his son, stories he hadn't spoken aloud to anyone. "Mary, she would have loved you," he'd murmur, brushing burrs from Goliath's tail. "She had a soft spot for the runts, said they had the most heart." He'd tell Goliath about teaching his boy Sammy how to fish in the creek that snaked through the back pasture, the same creek where he now led the bull to drink on hot afternoons. Have you ever felt a grief so deep it becomes the air you breathe? The silence in every room? Arthur had. But now, the silence was different. It was shared. It was punctuated by the soft munching of hay, the heavy, contented sighs of a healing animal. The bull became his confidant, his silent confessor. And in the bull's quiet, steady presence, Arthur found a way to start living again, not just existing. Goliath was not a replacement for what he had lost, but he was a bridge back to the world, a reason to feel, to care, to hope. The two of them, the man and the bull, were two solitary souls healing each other in the quiet sanctuary of a forgotten Texas farm. The Texas sun beat down, turning the air into a shimmering haze. The time for hiding in the barn was over. It was time to build not just trust, but strength. Arthur's training methods were as unconventional as his purchase of the bull. There were no ropes, no prods, no shouts of command. There was only patience and an intuitive understanding of the creature before him. He started simply. He would walk the perimeter of the vast pasture, and after a few days of watching from a distance, Goliath began to follow, his gait growing stronger, more confident with each passing week. The bull who once couldn't stand without trembling was now keeping pace with the man, his head held high, his dark eyes curious and intelligent. Arthur would lead him to the creek at the back of the property, a gentle, meandering stream bordered by thick, sturdy cottonwood trees. He'd encourage Goliath to walk through the shallow water, to feel its cool current against his legs. At first, the bull was hesitant, but with Arthur's calm voice and steady presence beside him, he soon came to love the water, splashing playfully like a calf. The community, what little of it paid attention, remained skeptical. One afternoon, a neighboring rancher named Hank pulled his truck up to the fence line, leaning out the window and spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Still got that $2 mistake, I see," Hank drawled, a smirk playing on his lips. "You gonna teach him to sing, or is he just for decoration?" Arthur, who was standing with Goliath near the fence, just gave a slow, easy smile. He didn't offer a defense or an explanation. He simply ran a hand along Goliath's now broad back. The bull, who would have once bolted from the sound of the truck, stood his ground, his massive form a silent testament to Arthur's care. He eyed Hank's truck with a placid indifference, then nudged Arthur's hand, asking for another scratch. Hank's smirk faltered slightly. The animal before him was not the same pathetic creature from the auction. His coat was a deep, rich chocolate brown, gleaming with health. The ribs were gone, replaced by thick layers of muscle that rippled under his skin. He was big, bigger than any of Hank's own prize bulls, and there was a calm intelligence in his eyes that was almost unnerving. Hank grunted, putting the truck in gear. Still a waste of good pasture. But as he drove away, the certainty in his voice was gone. He had seen something he didn't understand. The bond between the quiet man and the giant bull was a strange, silent language he couldn't decipher, and for the first time, he wondered if he had missed something important that day at the auction. Arthur watched him go, then turned back to Goliath. "Don't you mind him, big fella," he murmured. "They see what was. They don't see what is." And what was a miracle in the making, a quiet rebellion against judgment, growing stronger one day at a time. A year bled into two, and the seasons turned the Texas landscape from the vibrant green of spring to the scorched gold of summer, over and over. Life on Arthur's farm settled into a rhythm, a peaceful melody composed of quiet companionship. The small, fragile moments of trust had solidified into an unbreakable, unspoken bond. One late autumn afternoon, a powerful storm, a real Texas gully washer, had swept through the region the night before, leaving a trail of debris. A massive oak tree at the edge of the far pasture, one that had stood for a century, had finally succumbed to the wind and rain, crashing down across a vital section of fence line. Arthur discovered it at dawn. The trunk was enormous, far too heavy for his tractor to move, and it had crushed 3 fence posts, leaving a gaping hole. He spent the morning trying to chop away the smaller branches, his muscles straining, his sweat mingling with the damp morning air. He was making little progress. It was a job for 3 men, not one. Frustrated and tired, he sat down on a nearby rock, wiping his brow. Goliath, who had been grazing peacefully nearby, seemed to sense his master's struggle. The great bull ambled over, his massive head lowering to nudge Arthur's shoulder gently, a familiar gesture of comfort. Arthur smiled, patting the bull's broad nose. "It's no good, big fella. That thing's bigger than a house." He stood up, ready to walk back to the barn for more tools, when Goliath did something extraordinary. The bull walked over to the fallen oak. He lowered his head, positioning the thick, muscular base of his horns against the main trunk. His powerful legs dug into the soft earth, finding purchase. And then, with a low grunt that seemed to rumble up from the very core of his being, he pushed. Muscles Arthur had so patiently helped build now coiled and bunched, a breathtaking display of raw, controlled power. The massive log, which Arthur's machinery couldn't budge, began to groan. It scraped against the ground, shifting an inch, then 2. Goliath repositioned himself, took a deep breath that steamed in the cool air, and pushed again. With a final, shuddering heave, the colossal trunk rolled clear of the broken fence line. Arthur stood frozen, his axe forgotten in his hand. He was speechless. He had known Goliath was strong, but this was different. This wasn't just strength. It was intention. It was help. It was as if the bull understood the problem and had offered the solution. Goliath shook his head as if clearing it, then turned and looked at Arthur, his dark eyes soft and questioning. In that moment, the last vestiges of the $2 mistake vanished forever, replaced by an overwhelming sense of awe. This was not just an animal he had saved. This was a partner. A guardian. The ironic name he had chosen in a moment of pity had become a prophecy. Goliath was no longer just his name. It was his nature. And in the quiet morning light, standing before the impossible task his friend had just accomplished, Arthur felt a profound sense of safety he hadn't known in years. Years flowed by like the gentle current of the creek in the back pasture. Goliath grew into a magnificent creature, a titan of muscle and might. Yet he remained as gentle as the day he first rested his head on Arthur's shoulder. His presence was a constant, comforting weight in Arthur's life. The farm was no longer a place of solitude, but a sanctuary for 2. Their days were a tapestry of shared, simple moments. Mornings began with Arthur's soft voice greeting the bull, and evenings ended with the 2 of them watching the sunset from a small hill overlooking the pasture. Goliath munching contentedly on the sweet grass, while Arthur sat leaning against his powerful flank. The bull was a local legend now. People who once mocked would slow their trucks, not to jeer, but to marvel at the sight of the giant animal moving with such grace or standing placidly beside the quiet man. The story of the $2 bull had become a piece of local folklore, a modern parable whispered about at the feed store. Arthur, for his part, had changed too. The deep lines of sorrow on his face had softened. A quiet smile was no longer a rarity. He still kept mostly to himself, but the fortress of his grief had been dismantled, brick, by the steady, unconditional love of his unlikely companion. He had found his family again, not in the past, but right here, in the present, in the form of a 10-ton bull with a heart as big as Texas. The creek, the one where Arthur had taught Goliath to overcome his fear of water, remained their favorite spot. On hot summer days, Goliath would stand shoulder-deep in the cool, clear stream, while Arthur sat on the bank, skipping stones across the surface, just as he had with his son Sammy. The water was a symbol of their journey, a place of healing, of lessons learned, of peace. It was a constant, reliable presence, its gentle murmur the soundtrack to their quiet life. Have you ever known a peace so complete that it feels like it will last forever? A moment in time so perfect you wish you could build a house there and never leave. That was Arthur's life with Goliath. It was a fragile, beautiful snow globe of contentment. But as with all things fragile, the world outside was about to shake it. That summer, the rains came and didn't stop. For a week, the sky was a bruised, weeping gray. The ground became a sodden sponge, unable to absorb another drop. The little creek, their peaceful sanctuary, began to change. Its gentle murmur turned into a low, angry growl. It swelled, its clear water turning a muddy, turbulent brown, beginning to creep over its banks, swallowing the familiar landscape inch by inch. The world was darkening, and the stage was being set for a final, terrifying test of a bond forged in ridicule and tempered by love. The sky broke open. The angry gray turned to a furious, bruised black, and the rain fell not in drops, but in solid, wind-whipped sheets that hammered against the roof of the farmhouse. The low growl of the creek escalated into a deafening roar, the sound of a beast unchained. Arthur stood on his porch, the wind tearing at his clothes, and watched in disbelief as the familiar landscape of his life was erased by a churning, muddy deluge. The water was no longer just over the banks. It was a rushing, violent river, devouring his pasture, swallowing fence posts as if they were toothpicks. The water rose with terrifying speed, creeping up the gentle slope towards his home and his barn. He had to get Goliath. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through his shock. He grabbed a heavy rain slicker and plunged into the storm, the rain so thick he could barely see. The wind fought him, pushing him back, screaming in his ears. The ground beneath his feet was a treacherous soup of mud and water. He finally reached the barn, his heart pounding with a primal fear. He threw open the door. Goliath was there, standing in the center of his stall. But he wasn't panicked. He was eerily calm. He stood solid as a mountain, his intelligent eyes fixed on Arthur, a low rumble in his chest that wasn't fear, but something else, recognition. "Come on, big fella. We gotta go." "To the high ground!" Arthur shouted over the storm's fury, fumbling with the latch on the stall. He led Goliath out into the maelstrom. The water was already shin-deep, cold and pulling with a frightening current. They needed to get to the small hill behind the house, the highest point on the property. They had only taken a few steps when a sound like a freight train ripped through the air. An entire section of the engorged creek bank collapsed upstream, sending a monstrous wave, a wall of water filled with debris and uprooted trees, surging directly toward them. There was no time to run. The wave hit them with the force of a battering ram. Arthur was ripped from his feet, his breath stolen from his lungs as he was plunged into the violent, debris-filled torrent. He was tossed and turned, his head striking something hard. A flash of white-hot pain, and then the world began to dim. He was drowning, his strength failing, the roar of the water filling his ears, his mind, his soul. "This is it," he thought, a strange calm settling over him. "I'm coming, Mary. I'm coming, Sammy." His last conscious sight was of the churning brown water closing over his head. But through that dark curtain, another shape moved. A massive, powerful form, plunging into the deadliest part of the current without hesitation. It was Goliath. The bull, who was once terrified of a puddle, was now charging into a watery hell, his eyes fixed on the spot where his friend had disappeared. Goliath's world was a symphony of chaos, the roar of the water, the crack of breaking trees, the sting of the driving rain. But he filtered it all out. His entire being, every ounce of his immense strength and every fiber of his loyal heart, was focused on a single point: Arthur. He saw Arthur go under, and a primal instinct, deeper than fear, deeper than survival, took over. He plunged his massive head beneath the churning surface, his eyes scanning the murky depths. He saw a flash of Arthur's blue work shirt. Driving his powerful legs against the current, he pushed forward, a living bulldozer against the flood. He reached Arthur just as the man's body went limp. He nudged him hard with his snout. Once, twice, no response. The current was dragging them both toward a snarl of fallen trees and barbed wire, a certain death trap. There was no time. Goliath did the only thing he could. He hooked the thick, strong base of his horn carefully under Arthur's arm, lifting his head and torso just above the waterline. He had to keep Arthur's face out of the water. With his friend now secured against his powerful neck, Goliath turned his body to face the raging current. He became a living breakwater, taking the full, brutal force of the flood upon his own broad chest and shoulders. Every muscle strained, every sinew screamed in protest. The water fought him, debris slammed into his sides, but he did not yield. He held his ground. Then, slowly, painstakingly, he began to move. It was a battle for every single inch. He planted one hoof, then another, his legs trembling with the colossal effort. He was fighting the weight of the water, the pull of the current, and the dead weight of the man he was determined to save. He wasn't just moving toward the hill, he was pushing the flood itself back. Minutes felt like hours. For anyone watching, it would have been an unbelievable sight. A great bull, acting as both a shield and a vessel, ferrying a man through a raging flood. Finally, his hooves found purchase on soggier but more solid ground. He was on the slope of the hill. He drove forward with a final, desperate surge of power, pushing and pulling until Arthur's body was clear of the main current, resting on the muddy incline. Goliath collapsed beside him, his massive chest heaving, his body shaking with exhaustion. He lay his great head next to Arthur, nudging his face, licking his cheek with his rough tongue, making low, guttural sounds of distress. Arthur sputtered, coughed up a lungful of dirty water, and his eyes fluttered open. He was bruised, battered, and disoriented, but he was alive. He looked up into the deep, loyal eyes of his savior. The storm still raged around them, but on that small island of survival, there was only a profound, silent understanding. "Goliath," Arthur rasped, his voice barely a whisper. You saved me." He reached up a trembling hand and laid it on the bull's wet cheek. "My good boy, you saved me." When the sun finally rose the next morning, it illuminated a world remade by water. The landscape was a wreck of mud, silt, and broken things. The pasture was gone, the fences obliterated, the barn floor coated in a thick layer of brown sludge. It was a scene of utter devastation. But on the small green hill that had become their ark, Arthur and Goliath sat together, watching the dawn. Arthur was sore, wrapped in a blanket someone had brought, but he was whole. Goliath, covered in mud and a few new scratches, stood beside him, a silent, immovable guardian. The floodwaters had receded, leaving behind the evidence of their fury. News travels fast in a small town, and the story of what had happened traveled faster than the flood itself. By mid-morning, a small crowd had gathered at the end of Arthur's washed-out driveway. It was Hank, the skeptical neighbor, and a dozen other folks from town. They weren't there to mock or to gloat. They were there in stunned, reverent silence. They looked at the path of the flood, at the debris field where Arthur and Goliath had been, and then at the two survivors on the hill. They saw the giant bull standing protectively over the quiet man, and they finally understood. They hadn't seen a $2 mistake. They had seen a hero waiting for someone to believe in him. Hank was the first to walk forward, sloshing through the mud. He stopped before Arthur, his hat in his hands, his face a mixture of awe and shame. "Arthur," he said, his voice humbled. We came to help." Arthur looked at Hank, and then at the faces of his neighbors, and he saw no judgment. He saw community. He saw hands ready to work, ready to rebuild. He gave a slow nod, a tired but genuine smile gracing his lips. The cleanup was long and hard, but Arthur was not alone. The community rallied around him, a flurry of hands and hearts helping to clear the debris, mend the fences, and put his world back together. And through it all, Goliath was there, a calm, majestic presence overseeing the reconstruction of the home he had saved. The story of the $2 bull became more than folklore. It became a legend. A testament to the idea that strength isn't always loud and aggressive, that worth isn't determined by a price tag, and that the deepest bonds can be forged in the most unlikely of places. Months later, life returned to its peaceful rhythm. The pasture grew green again. The creek settled back into its gentle murmur. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold, Arthur sat on the hill, leaning against Goliath's warm, solid flank. He looked out over his rebuilt farm, a place washed clean of sorrow and baptized in a miracle. He was no longer the hollow man defined by what he had lost. He was Arthur, the man who was saved by a bull. He ran his hand over Goliath's strong back. "Who would have thought? Huh, big fella," he whispered. "The weakest bull in Texas." Goliath turned his great head and nudged him, a soft rumble in his chest. In that quiet moment, in that unbreakable bond between man and beast, was a truth more powerful than any flood. Sometimes, the things we rescue end up rescuing us right back.